Something amazing happened on the first few days following the derecho. And no, it wasn't the way that people came together to help each other out. Neighbor checking in on or helping out other neighbor. Though that was pretty amazing too. No, what I'm talking about is the first few days when all the electricity was out and the curfew was established. When the whole city had gone dark. And we all sat around in our flashlight lit homes and thought, well, what now? No internet, no electricity. And then we wandered outside, into our driveways, out onto our deck, out into our yards, and we looked up. We looked up and saw the stars, and not just a few stars, but so many stars. We could see the stars that we could name, the Big Dipper, Orion, the North Star, and a bunch that we couldn't. We could see the Milky Way, we could see millions upon millions of stars, and for a moment, we caught our breath in wonder. And you would hear people talk the next day. In between the chainsawing and the brush hauling, in between the food distribution and the generator procurement, in between the bone tiredness and the insurance conversations, you would hear people talking. Did you see the stars? Go outside. Look up tonight. Did you see the stars? I'd like to imagine that it is this kind of night sky that Abraham sees in our reading for today as he converses with God. Now, this is not the first time that Abraham and God have had a heart-to-heart. And to understand Abraham in this moment, we do have to know a bit about his beginnings. Abraham's original name, as we see it in this text, was Abram, and he was married to Sarai, whom we will see later in the story as Sarah. They lived in the city of Ur, which archaeologists tell us is on the bank of the Euphrates River, right at the mouth of the river as it emptied into the Persian Gulf. The ancient city of Ur is in Iraq, about 225 miles south of Baghdad. It is the far eastern tip of what is known as the Fertile Crescent. And within the Fertile Crescent, the soil is so rich with nutrients and the climate so conducive to farming that they had a good, consistent food supply very early on and developed a healthy economy. Those same archaeologists also tell us that Ur had a long history, even before Abraham. It was one of the first village establishments around 4,000 BC. So by the time Abraham and Sarah lived there, the city was nearly 2,000 years old already and was surprisingly sophisticated. The average home around that time maybe had 13 or 14 rooms, which would house a generational family, and some of them even had rudimentary running water. Children were educated at schools where they wrote on clay tablets using styluses, or some of them were at least, using what was the beginnings of a written alphabet. They learned mathematics. They knew how to figure square roots. Abram and Sarai did not have children to send to school, but in all other ways they were well off. Their whole family lived there on that land, and it had been their fathers before them, and they had nephews and nieces, even though they didn't have children of their own. Abram had done well. And at the age of 75, he was probably set to retire into sort of a quieter way of life. It was time for him and Sarai to enjoy their golden years. And then God spoke. We don't know anything about Abram's faith before the encounter with God. We don't know if he knew anything about God as we understand God being. But we do know that when God called Abram, Abram responded. the Lord tells him, leave your land, leave your family, leave your father's household for a land that I will show you. So Abram and Sarai pack up their possessions and leave. Now, I think sometimes we have an image of Abram and Sarai aimlessly wandering about until God pointed him in a direction. But more likely, it is the case that he was really leaving. He was leaving something, and that something for him was pretty good. In order to experience the blessing and to be the blessing, Abraham would have to leave behind his land, his safety, and his family's protection. He would have to leave behind the ways he's provided for his own in order to discover an unknown land and an impossible family. But he does it. He pulls up stakes and goes. And then the story goes on. For at this point in the scripture for today, Abraham and Sarah have now had a number of years under their belt, or some time under the belt. They've done well, and their flocks have grown. But that has meant a break with the only extended family they've remained in contact with, Lot, Abraham's nephew. The land can no longer hold them both, and they've had to split and go their separate ways. Also, Abraham and Sarah have gotten caught in the mix of a war between neighboring kingdoms, and they've had to do some negotiations themselves. A lot has happened, and yet there is no sign of the promised progeny. So Abraham begins off this conversation with God by suggesting that he do the work of inheritance himself. I've got it all lined up, God, he said. I've got it all lined up. My cousin, Eliezer, is going to inherit. No worries at all. Even though he is worried. Even if this promised son does not materialize, there's another plan. Now, this will be a theme over the next decade with Abraham because in the moment, it doesn't seem like God's going to back up God's promises. And Abram still is very much believing that it's sort of an impossibility anyway. People like Abraham and Sarah, people who are in their twilight years, those kind of people don't have children. According to all that Abraham knows about human biology, this promise is never going to come to fruition. So holding tightly to his understandings and the way that life is, Abraham begins to work his own agenda. Sometimes you have to let go of something in order to make room for something else. A trapeze artist swinging back and forth in the air must let go for a moment to turn in midair and grab the other bar. There is no way to both hold on to the old bar and grab the new bar simultaneously. One must let go in order to make room for something else. Abraham is holding on tightly to his own understandings, to his own expectations about what it is possible for God to do. And we'll see to his own dependence on self-reliance. And so God takes him outside into the pitch black darkness of a desert night and says, "Look up. Do you see the stars?" Sometimes you have to let go of something in order to make room for something else. A woman, we'll call her June, reflects on her own experiences helping out individuals and businesses in a flooded out Bethel Park, Pennsylvania, a few summers ago. She had banded together with some others in the community to host a benefit and help some particular families in that community that she knew of that were in need and needed to get through that crisis. And that crisis had passed, but there were still some funds left over. And this group was just trying to decide what to do with those funds when floods took over the town. And this group of community members, whom she now considers some of her closest friends, hit the ground running. They began organizing supplies and cleanup efforts, helping connect people and businesses with resources, and distributing gift cards that they had purchased with those extra funds that they still had in their account. They were doing amazing work. But that's not the whole story, because while June reflects on what she's been able to do and how she's been able to connect deeply with those friends and with her community, she's also recognized her story started with loss. About 18 months before, she had found herself painfully excluded from an important social group, people she had been friends with for years, since almost her childhood, and suddenly they stopped calling, they stopped inviting, her Friday nights went empty, her phone was silent, and she said it was painful and confusing. She didn't understand why she was being ghosted, and she was deeply hurt. But that's about the time that she volunteered to help with this benefit, because she had so much extra time. And now, she reflects, I was able to have all of this room in my life for this work that has been a blessing to others, but also has been a blessing to myself. People who now share deeply my values, and she recognizes that this has been a great opportunity to connect and build relationship with people that she had never met and never known, but had lived alongside all her life. Sometimes you have to let go of something to make room for something else. Leave it all behind, God says. But then God quickly follows with these words, I will make of you a great nation, blessing you, making your name great, so that you will be a blessing. Look up at the stars, and in that moment of wonder and awe, know your descendants shall be that many. A blessing is never primarily about just me. God says to Abraham, I will bless you, but that blessing is not for you to keep in, it's for you to give out. It's not about your status or your ego or your fulfillment. Actually, in the biblical sense, it really isn't even about stuff, which is how we often hear the word blessing being used. I've been blessed with this or blessed with that thing. In the Bible, blessing is related to notice, to recognition, to pronouncement. The first time we see the word bless in the Bible, it doesn't even involve human beings. In Genesis 1, we are told God created the great creatures of the sea. God created the great creatures of the sea and every living and moving thing with which the water teems. And God blessed them, and God said, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the water and the seas. That's Genesis 1. God noticed them and then pronounced a purpose, a future for them. When Isaac blesses Jacob, he notices him, he sees him, and pronounces him an heir. In the Beatitudes, Jesus says, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. God notices, God sees those who sorrow, and pronounces that their future will hold comfort. But I digress. But let's put that into play in our text today. God takes notice of us and pronounces a hopeful future, so that we can take notice of others and do the same. The San Francisco Chronicle ran a story about a Metro Transit operator named Linda Wilson Allen. She drives a bus in San Francisco, which if you've seen the narrow streets of San Francisco, that is sort of a miracle enough. But the article isn't about her driving skill, it is about her love for the people on her bus. It's simple but striking. So what this Linda does is that she knows the regulars on her bus. She knows them by name. If they're late, she'll actually stop and wait for them and then make up the time along her route. Linda noticed a woman in her 80s named Elsie. Elsie was struggling with some groceries and she needed to take the bus. Linda stopped the bus, got out of her driver's seat, went out, and carried the groceries onto the bus. Today, Elsie lets other buses pass by her at the bus stop, and she waits so she can ride with Linda on her bus. Linda noticed a woman named Tanya, who sometimes took her bus to get back to the women's shelter. Tanya was out on the street looking a little lost. It was almost Thanksgiving, so Linda stopped the bus, leaned out, and yelled, "Hey, are you all by yourself? It's almost Thanksgiving. Why don't you come over to my place and kick it with me and the kids?" And now she and Tanya are friends. The reporter who wrote this article rides on Linda's bus. He said she has built such a community on her bus that passengers bring her gifts. They bring her potted plants and floral bouquets. When people found out that Linda likes to wear scarves to accessorize her uniform, they started giving her scarves as presents. One passenger upgraded her gift to a rabbit fur collar. They are a blessing. They are noticing her right back. And if you think about what an unglamorous, non-prestigious, thankless job it is to drive a bus, not much money, traffic jams, cranky passengers, engines that break down, gum on seats, spills on the floor, yet she manages in her job to notice and to bring brightness to all those who cross her path. She begins her day, she says, in prayer, talking to God about how she should approach her day. And when she gets to the end of her line, she always ends it with, "That's all, guys. I love you. Take care." When God calls us to something, God doesn't promise it will be easy. Usually involves getting stretched and pulled out of our comfort zone, and most of the time, well past where we thought we were capable of going. It may be, as June discovered, couched in the grief of losing something else. But what God doesn't promise us is that, but while God doesn't promise us that it will be easy, God does promise to be with us, so that whether we are feeling insecure, questioning whether we are on the right path or not, or maybe when the path seems nothing more than a grueling daily grind, we may need, just like Linda, to stop and breathe and let God's presence infuse us. God is about to do remarkable things through Abraham, and God will do remarkable things through us. Abraham didn't do much more than respond, and that's all God is waiting for us to do today, to spread God's notice and love with all who cross our own path, to look up at the stars in the midst of all the worry and concern of our days and be struck with the wonder of God's promise and God's presence, to let go of the trapeze bar even before we fully grasped the other, to trust and to answer God's call. Amen.